My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 14. When Ken went to bed that night, he kissed his mother and then threw his arms around her and held her fiercely for a moment. Smiling, she put her hand on his head. "Well, Kenny," her violet eyes were soft and understanding. He went upstairs, smiling back at her over his shoulder, having a secret with her. He knew that she knew. He lit the candle in his room and stood staring at the flickering light. This was like a last day. The last day before school is out, or before Christmas, or before his mother came back after a visit in the East. Tomorrow was the day when, really, his life would begin. He would get his colt. He had been thinking about the filly all day. He could still see her streaking past him, the wild, terrified eyes turned to him in appeal, the hair blown back from her face like a girl's, and the long, slim legs moving so fast they were a blur, like the spokes of a wheel. He couldn't quite remember the colour of her, orange, pink, tangerine colour, tail and mane white, like the hair of an albino boy at school. Albino, of course. Her grandsire was the albino, the famous albino stud. He felt a little uneasy at this. Albino blood wasn't safe blood for a filly to have, but perhaps she hadn't much of it. Perhaps the cream tail and mane came from Banner, her sire. Banner had a cream tail and mane too when he was a colt. Lots of sorrel colts had. He hoped she would be docile and good, not like Rocket. Which would she take after, Rocket or Banner? He hadn't had time to get a good look into her eyes. Rocket's eyes had that wild, wicked white ring around them. Ken began to undress. Walking around his room, his eyes caught sight of the pictures on the wall. They didn't interest him. The speed of her! She had run away from Banner. He kept thinking about that. It hardly seemed possible. His father always said Rocket was the fastest horse on the ranch, and now Rocket's filly had run away from Banner. He had gone up to look at her again that afternoon. Hadn't been able to keep away. He had ridden up on Baldy and found the yearlings all grazing together on the far side of Saddleback. And when they saw him and Baldy, they all took off across the mountain. Ken had galloped along the crest above them watching the filly. Footing made no difference to her. She floated across the ravines, always 2 lengths ahead of the others. Her pinkish cream mane and tail whipped in the wind. Her long, delicate legs had only to aim, it seemed, at a particular spot for her to reach it and sail on. She seemed to Ken a fairy horse. She was simply nothing like any of the others. Riding down the mountain again, Ken had traced back all his recollections of her. The summer before, when he and Howard had seen the spring colts. He hadn't especially noticed her. He remembered that he had seen her even before that, soon after she was born. He had been out with Gus one day in the meadow during the spring holiday. They were clearing some driftwood out of the irrigation ditch, and they had seen Rocket standing in a gully on the hillside, quiet for once, and eyeing them cautiously. "Aye, Bessy's got a colt," said Gus, and they walked carefully up the draw. Rocket gave a wild snort, thrust her feet out, shook her head wickedly, then fled away. And as they reached the spot, they saw standing there the wavering, pinkish colt, barely able to keep its feet. It gave a little squeak and started after its mother on crooked, wobbling legs. "Yee whiz, look at dee little Flicka," said Gus. "What does Flicka mean, Gus?" "Swedish for little girl, Ken." He had seen the filly again late in the fall. She was half pink, half yellow, with streaked, untidy-looking hair. She was awkward and ungainly, with legs long too, haunches a little too high. And then he had gone away to school and hadn't seen her again until now. She ran away from Banner. Her eyes, they had looked like balls of fire this morning. What colour were they? Banner's were brown with flecks of gold, or gold with flecks of brown. Her speed and her delicate curving lines made him think of a greyhound he had seen running once. But really, she was more like just a little girl than anything. The way her face looked, the way her blonde hair blew. A little girl. Ken blew out the light and got into bed, and before the smile had faded from his face, he was asleep. I'll take that sorrel filly of Rocket's, the one with the cream tail and mane. Ken made his announcement at the breakfast table. After he spoke, there was a moment's astonished silence. Nell groped for recollection and said, "A sorrel filly? I can't seem to remember that one at all. What's her name?" But Rob remembered. The smile faded from his face as he looked at Ken. "Rocket's filly, Ken?" "Yes, sir." Ken's face changed too. There was no mistaking his father's displeasure. "I was hoping you'd make a wise choice. You know what I think of Rocket, that whole line of horses." Ken looked down. The colour ebbed from his cheeks. "She's fast, Dad, and Rocket's fast. It's the worst line of horses I've got. There's never one amongst them with real sense. The mares are hellions and the stallions outlaws. They're untamable. I'll tame her." Rob guffawed. "Not I. Not anyone has ever been able to really tame any of them." Kenny's chest heaved. "Better change your mind, Ken. You want a horse that'll be a real friend to you, don't you?" "Yes." Kenny's voice was unsteady. "Well, you'll never make a friend of that filly. Last fall, after all the colts had been weaned and separated from their dams, she and Rocket got back together. No fence will hold 'em. She's all out and scarred up already from tearing through barbed wire after that of a mother of hers." Kenny looked stubbornly at his plate. "Change your mind?" asked Howard briskly. "No." "I don't remember seeing her this year," said Nell. "No," said Rob. "When I drove you up a couple of months ago to look them over and name them and write down their descriptions, there was a bunch missing. Don't you remember?" "Oh, yes. Then she's never been named." "I've named her," said Ken. "Her name is Flicka." "Flicka?" said Nell cheerfully. "That's a pretty name." But McLaughlin made no comment, and there was a painful silence. Ken felt he ought to look at his father, but he was afraid to. Everything was changed again. They weren't friends anymore. He forced himself to look up, met his father's angry eyes for a moment, then quickly looked down again. "Well," McLaughlin barked, "it's your funeral, or hers. Remember one thing. I'm not going to be out of pocket on account of this. Every time you turn around, you cost me money." Ken looked up, wonderingly, and shook his head. "Time's money, remember," said his father. "I had planned to give you a reasonable amount of help in breaking and taming your colt. Just enough, but there's no such thing as enough with those horses." Gus appeared at the door and said, "What's today, boss?" McLaughlin shouted, "We're going out on the range to bring in the yearlings. Saddle Taggart, Lady and Shorty." Gus disappeared, and McLaughlin pushed his chair back. "First thing to do is to get her in. Do you know where the yearlings are?" "They were on the far side of the saddleback late yesterday afternoon, the west end, down by Dale's ranch." "Well, you're the boss on this roundup. You can ride Shorty." McLaughlin and Gus and Ken went out to bring the yearlings in. Howard stood at the county gate to open and close it. They found the yearlings easily. When they saw that they were being pursued, they took to their heels. Ken was entranced to watch Flicka, the speed of her, the power, the wildness. She led the band. He sat motionless, just watching and holding Shorty in, when his father thundered past on Taggart and shouted, "Well, what's the matter? Why didn't you turn 'em?" Ken woke up and galloped after them. Shorty brought in the whole band. The corral gates were closed, and an hour was spent shunting the ponies in and out and through the chutes until Flicka was left alone in the small, round branding corral. Gus mounted Shorty and drove the others away, through the gate and up the saddleback. But Flicka did not intend to be left. She hurled herself against the poles which walled the corral. She tried to jump them. They were 7 feet high. She caught her front feet over the top rung, clung, scrambled, while Kenny held his breath for fear the slender legs would be caught between the bars and snapped. Her hold broke. She fell over backwards, rolled, screamed, tore around the corral. One of the bars broke. She hurled herself again. Another went. She saw the opening, and as neatly as a dog crawls through a fence, inserted her head and forefeet, scrambled through, and fled away, bleeding in a dozen places. As Gus was coming back, just about to close the gate to the county road, the sorrel whipped through it, sailed across the road and ditch with her inimitable floating leap, and went up the side of the saddleback like a jackrabbit. From way up on the mountain, Gus heard excited whinnies as she joined the band he had just driven up, and the last he saw of them, they were strung out along the crest running like deer. "Yee whiz," said Gus, and stood motionless, staring until the ponies had disappeared over the ridge. Then he closed the gate, remounted Shorty, and rode back to the corrals. Walking down from the corrals, Rob McLaughlin gave Kenny one more chance to change his mind. "Better pick a horse that you have some hope of riding one day. I'd have got rid of this whole line of stock if they weren't so fast that have had the fool idea that someday there might turn out one gentle one in the lot, and I'd have a race horse. But there's never been one so far, and it's not going to be Flicka." "It's not going to be Flicka," chanted Howard. "Maybe she might be gentle," said Ken, and although his lips trembled, there was fanatical determination in his eye. "Ken," said McLaughlin, "it's up to you. If you say you want her, we'll get her, but she wouldn't be the first of that line to die rather than give in. They're beautiful, and they're fast, but let me tell you this, young man, they're loco." Ken flinched under his father's direct glance. "If I go after her again, I'll not give up whatever comes. Understand what I mean by that?" "Yes, what do you say?" "I want her." "That's settled then." And suddenly Rob seemed calm and indifferent. "We'll bring her in again tomorrow or next day. I've got other work for this afternoon." That's the end of chapter 14. Good night. Sleep tight.